How far can Russia go in terms of being present in other places before it's spreading itself too thinly? Do you think it's going to come to a head at this point, that Russia really has to refine its other external activities because it's putting all its eggs in one basket over Ukraine?
I mean, there's a bean counter in the Kremlin somewhere that just looks at ROI. What is our return on investments? Well, when they fund hundreds of millions of dollars into their information warfare campaigns across Africa, they produce content in the local languages talking about the evil European colonial empires and how Russia has always been a champion of the small guy who is going to hold back the imperial powers and their exploitation of Africa.
This is the Global Gambit. No, it is very sad. I think a lot of that is bereavement from the 20th century and the amount of territory the Hungarians lost, right? But, okay, so you're an American and you can't speak for Europeans, but what can you speak to then, right? You feel optimistic that Trump is not necessarily going to do more to support Ukraine himself, but he's not going to be an obstacle or barrier, an impediment to Congress or whatever, providing more support to Ukraine. Would that be correct? And if so, what do you think the American government, the Congress will do?
Trump likes Putin, likes the Russians, wants to be friends with them, but the Russians aren't cooperating. The Russians aren't doing what Trump wants. So Trump has shifted to a neutral position. Anybody in his party or his administration who wants to be supportive of Ukraine or critical of Russia, he's not going to punish them. He's not going to stop them. So in a Senate testimony, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked, is Vladimir Putin a war criminal? And the Treasury Secretary didn't hesitate. He said, yeah, Vladimir Putin is a war criminal. But then again, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he was directly asked by a senator, is Vladimir Putin a war criminal? And Marco Rubio quibbled. He didn't want to say that. That's a conflictory position. Either everybody in Trump's cabinet should be saying Putin is a war criminal, or none of them should be saying it. So the fact that they're giving conflicting statements, as well as members of the House and members of the Senate who are Republicans, they're all saying different things. Trump has shifted. He's saying, I don't want to be the arbiter on this issue. People can take whatever position they want. So what this is leading to is John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, and even Speaker Mike Johnson. They're now saying they're supportive of this Russia sanctions bill. So if half of MAGA, half of Republicans in the Senate, half in the House vote for it, and then every Democrat basically votes for it, those are super majorities. This is basically where we were with the last financial aid package being voted on, 80 senators and 300 or so members of the House. So it'll pass with super majorities. This vote, maybe by the time this podcast is up, the vote will have already happened, but the sanctions bill is going to pass. And once we get over this hurdle, this is the barrier we have to get past. Once Donald Trump has already taken an action that is going to upset the Russians, we're now on this path of the Trump administration saying and doing things that will harm Russia and support Ukraine. So now that we come to the next decision, Zelensky wants to buy some Patriot systems. He's willing to pay $1.5 billion per Patriot battery system. Trump hasn't approved the sale. But if we're already voting on sanctions and Trump is signing the bill into law, okay, well, Trump's going to say, the next time the Russians blow up an apartment building in Kyiv, Russia's going to say, okay, I'm going to approve the sale of these Patriot systems. I'm going to approve the transfer of this. I'm going to allow the sale of that. Like, that's the path we're now on, where every time Russia does something horrific in the media, Trump's going to respond by saying, okay, well, I will allow the sale of this, the transfer of that, the approval of this. And we're basically back to where we were with Joe Biden. It's the same U.S. policy. Harm Russia, help Ukraine.
And what do you think about the Russian state at the moment? Obviously, we like to talk about the imminent implosion of the Russian economy, or the idea that sort of is the main shift in the war, strategically speaking, not tactically speaking, is going to come from within Russia. Do you still feel that? Do you have that confidence, or you think it's really dependent upon Ukraine's endurance, resilience, and what comes in the support from
central bank interest rates are still over 20%. Inflation is still over 10% year over year. Russia has the worst demographics, almost in the world, especially with young people fleeing the country or dying in this war. Russia has no future in its current form. And I think to a certain extent that is why Russia is so obsessed with absorbing Ukraine and stealing their children, because they understand that demographics don't favor them long term. But short term, is Russia going to have some kind of economic crisis? And all of the indications are there. Russia's largest shipping company, Samkomflot, if I remember the name of it, but they posted their Q1 earnings and they had, like $200 million in operating losses, whereas in Q1 a year ago they were $300 million in profits. They had a surplus. Gazprom and Russia's other major corporations, they just announced they're suspending their dividends for Q4 and Q1. But we can be honest, these dividends are never coming back. They're never coming back because they can't afford to pay them. All of Russia's largest corporations are operating at a loss, and they're borrowing money at insane interest rates to keep it going. No CEO of a publicly traded company in the United States would do what Russia's industry leaders are doing because they're not operating independently. The CEO of a publicly traded company has a fiduciary responsibility to his shareholders to operate at a profit. You have to fire employees, cut outputs, raise prices, whatever you got to do to be positive on the books. And none of these companies in Russia are doing that because they all take orders from the Kremlin. Every CEO of a strategically important asset or company was appointed by Putin and owes his job and wealth to Putin. And Putin designed the entire Russian economy this way. So in the event of a war, they just borrow money. And that's what keeps everything going. That's what is kept. The state Russian budgets, the state national debt is not the clock. It's the private borrowing and the corporate borrowing of all of these individuals and companies that is keeping everything in Russia going at the moment. And this is a house of cards. Like, they still have to somehow be making their minimum payments with 20% interest rates or whatever. And this just isn't sustainable over the next couple of years. I'm hoping that the strain is apparent sooner than later. And this is ultimately what is going to bring this war to an end. And that's going to be the total collapse of the Russian economy.
So I have a couple of questions for you about the military angle, but I did want to just share that at the time of recording, Trump has just spoken with Putin about Ukraine and Iran, I guess, because Russia's relationship with them. But more specifically on Ukraine, Putin's apparently told Trump that Russia's going to have to respond to Operation Spiderweb. Now, we've seen them do that to an extent already with the blanketing strikes over the past couple of days. But if that's going to happen, Jake, what do you think the Kremlin would attempt to do?
I mean, the speculation is that Putin wants to use a tactical nuke somewhere on the battlefield. So he's not going to use like a thermonuclear warhead on Kharkiv or Odessa or Kyiv. Like, he's not going to use a nuke on a city and kill 1 million people. He wants to use a smaller nuke, a tactical nuke, on like an airfield or some kind of troop concentration. Can't do that though. If you're using a nuke, you're using a nuke. And I've talked about this the last 3.5 years. I've made several videos why Russia will not or cannot use a nuclear weapon. I think the biggest concern for Putin is how India and China would respond.
Yeah.
How would the other major nuclear powers react to another nuclear power using a nuclear weapon in a war of choice, an offensive war to take more territory? All the other BS propaganda that Russia puts out at the end of the day, when you peel back all the layers of BS that the Russians put out, at the core of this entire war, it's just about a land grab. They don't care about the buildings. They don't care about the history. They don't care about the people. They just care about the land. And that's all they want. So if you're nuking people to steal their land, yeah, I think India and China might have something to say about that. And if they participate in sanctions on Russia's economy, that's lights out. So Xi has already done this. I think it was in 2023, Xi went to Moscow, and the reports are is that he told Putin to his face, under no circumstances, unless your core territories are being threatened, you can't use nukes. Aside from that, what else is Putin going to do? You know, this was last November, Putin launched his Orshnik IRBM, intermediate range ballistic missile from the Caspian on the city of Dnipro. And there was no warhead. There was no explosive device. It was just the IRBM fragments falling on the city of Dnipro. But it was Putin trying to threaten the world or demonstrate his nuclear capabilities. But so we don't know what Putin's going to do. I'm hoping it's another symbolic, act like that where he launches an ICBM or an IRBM that doesn't have a warhead, and then fragments just fall on a city and the war goes on. But no, Ukraine's in it to win it, and there's nothing that Russia can say or do that is going to make them agree to any of Russia's absurd demands at the moment.
I don't think anyone wants to be the first person to launch a nuclear warhead, however big or small it may be, and certainly not someone like Putin who wants to be seen as the protector, the savior of the modern day Russian Federation, right, or imperialist Russia or Mother Russia, whatever framing you want to use, right? He doesn't want to be seen as doing that, but yeah, I think it's crazy that we have all these Putinists and Kremlinites who argue, we can bash you out of the sky in a one immediate strike. Well, you can, but then what does that mean for your relationships with other major powers that you're increasingly relying on, i.e. China, India, and such? So, no, 100%. But, one of the key issues that I think we can't really deny, and people who are, on the side of Ukraine but acknowledge it from just a purely military standpoint, people like Michael Kaufman, for example, Ukraine does have a manpower shortage. There is a problem here, and with the events, shall we call them, around Sumy at the moment, and Ukraine, I think, has been looking at altering its conscription age again. How do you feel about this angle, this element? Are you worried, or you think that it's more about Ukraine's ability to create in-house technology to compensate?
If Ukraine is producing more of these FPV drones than Russia, if Ukraine has better operators than Russia, you can compensate for a manpower problem. I'm not going to tell Ukraine how to fight this war. It doesn't make sense to me that Ukraine does not conscript, draft, or mobilize 18 to 26-year-olds. I'm never going to understand that. They don't have to be in combat roles or combat positions, but there should not be young, able-bodied men in Ukraine not doing something productive for this war.
Right.
They can be given exemptions if they're working in the railroad service. They can be given exemptions if they're working in an artillery factory. But every young man in Ukraine needs to be doing something productive to support their state in this time of war. But it's not my country, not my people. They're going to make their own decisions, and they've done the calculations. And when you look at the average age of a soldier on the front lines for both Russia and Ukraine, it's like 38. The average age of a soldier on the front lines in this war is like 38. Wow. And I understand the argument. I know people in the comments section are going to say, we can't kill off our young. We need them to reproduce to have a future at all. But this isn't, in my opinion, this isn't a critical debate to have. Ukraine is doing more with less, and they're going to continue finding ways to do more with less. And Russia's manpower advantage, they've had it for 3.5 years. Mm-hmm. Where are the results on the battlefield? They've gone 10 kilometers in the direction of Toretsk and Donetsk. 3.5 years of fighting, continuous warfare, and they've gone 10 kilometers. They took Bakhmut at the end of 2022, early 2023. The next town on the road was Chasiv Yar, and they still don't have full control of Chasiv Yar 2 years later. There actually is a military science about troop concentrations in a war like this, trench warfare with landmines and artillery and now FPV drones. And if you increase the concentration of troops in a trench or a dugout, it just leads to higher casualties. Mm-hmm. Like they've done the military science. How many guys do we need to put on this line or in this trench to have like an 80 or 90% of holding it from an assault? And yeah, you could put 30 guys in that trench and they might 100% of the time be able to repel an attack. But then every time an artillery shell goes off or, a grad rocket, your casualties your casualties will go up faster and higher if you have more people in these positions. Russia and Ukraine both know this, which is why they want troops dispersed. They want thinner lines. But But yeah, sometimes Russia has a breakthrough and they take a wheat field, but what was the cost? How many soldiers, how many lives did they lose advancing 1 kilometer through an empty wheat field?
Yeah, I think it's really shown the asymmetry of this, hasn't it? I feel that word is a little bit overused these days, but certainly Ukraine can do more with less. You don't necessarily have to have tons and tons of the best strategic bombers, i.e., right, the staunch illustration of how well Ukraine has done with literal bits that you can buy off the shelf kind of components and take out these planes which are Soviet era, and Russia doesn't have the ability to physically replace because the parts don't exist anymore. The factories don't exist. It's insane. And on that point, I kind of wanted to bring it back a little bit to Spiderweb, because obviously one of the fallouts from this is going to be the blame game. Who in Russia is going to be blaming who? We've got the FSB fighting off against the military, part of the government, right? So are you getting that sense as well? Is this Russia sort of trying to scramble and keep a lid on this? Or they just don't care and they're just going to strike Ukraine and deal with it that way?
Nobody in Russia is ever held accountable for being incompetent. The only crime in Russia is betraying Putin. Mm-hmm. Not being loyal enough to Putin. So General Sorovikin, he was suspicious. Prigozhin obviously openly rebelled. He was taken out by Putin. We don't think or talk about Dmitry Utkin anymore, the neo-Nazi founder of the Wagner Group. So every time a Russian general screws up, fails, whatever, the Crocus City Hall attack, was anybody in Russia held accountable for that intelligence failure? It's just intelligence failure after intelligence failure. And the head of the FSB is never going to be fired. Shoigu was reassigned, but Gerasimov hasn't been fired. Like, how can Gerasimov still have a job after 3.5 years of this disaster? And it's because he's loyal to Putin. Shoigu is an idiot. He's incompetent, but he's loyal to Putin. That's the only quality that matters in Russia's entire government. Not being competent, not producing results. Loyalty to the dictator is the only thing that matters in a dictatorship. So no, I don't think anyone's going to be held accountable, and Russia's just going to pretend like everything's fine, and they're going to have to figure out how to reassign, their sortie coverage of these bombers across the Arctic and the Pacific and the Chinese border with less. They lost a third, either damaged or destroyed, and they're just going to reassign and pretend like it never happens, because that's how Russia copes with all of their failures and disasters.
But one of the things that you can argue whether or not it's competency or just quite good sort of distribution of resources, right? Or playing well with less. As you know, I was in Africa for a bit. I was in Namibia, and this is a country not only of contrast in its environments, but a country in competition. I had no idea the amount of influence Russia had down here. I mainly thought of it as China's backyard, but Russia's been historically there. And so the essence I get is that Russia's quite good at doing a fair amount with not that much, right? It doesn't have the economic size of China or America, but it does seem to be able to exert its influence, or at least have a presence, however small, in places quite far away. And so where I'm going with this is simply that, Bulgaria wants to join the Eurozone next year. We've just had this report from the Moldovan leader that Putin's maybe going to put 10,000 troops on the border in Transnistria. Like, how far can Russia go in terms of being present in other places before it's spreading itself too thinly? Do you think it's going to come to a head at this point, that Russia really has to refine its other external activities because it's putting all its eggs in one basket over Ukraine?
I mean, there's a bean counter in the Kremlin somewhere that just looks at ROI. What is our return on investments? When they fund hundreds of millions of dollars into their information warfare campaigns across Africa, they produce content in the local languages talking about the evil European colonial empires and how Russia has always been a champion of the small guy who is going to hold back the imperial powers and their exploitation of Africa. That's the narrative they put out. And there's no counter. The United States used to try and counter, authoritarian propaganda, but Elon Musk shut all that down, closing all of our overseas goodwill operations and information warfare fighting capabilities. So yeah, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, the liberal West has conceded it to authoritarian dictators. The Chinese spend hundreds of millions of dollars in shaping the opinion and beliefs of people in the developing world, and Russia does. And they do that to gain access, to gain influence, to get control of that diamond mine, to get control of those oil fields, to get control of the resources. So it has to be 10 to 1. I mean, if they put $100 million into bribes and information shaping in these countries, but they can get $1 billion back in, contracts and seizing assets and controlling natural resources, then yeah, it's just a good investment. It's just business. Manipulating people and brainwashing people is good business for authoritarians, which is why they're in Africa and South America and the developing world. But there's no counter coming from the liberal West.
But isn't it a weird dichotomy that sort of on one hand they sustain all these traditional formed military assets like the bombers, etc. They don't seem to be doing as much with the drones like Ukraine is, or maybe Ukraine's just more efficient and speedier at it. And yet, on the other hand, they are very good at leveraging sort of, if you want, influencer agents, I think one academic called it once, you getting influencers in America, right? Tim Pool and the others are part of that group. I can't remember earlier in the year when it was exposed, right? Paying them off to be parrots for the regime, the narrative. So are you not fearful that could continue? Or Russia doubles down on that in even more ways?
Oh, it's absolutely going to continue. It's absolutely going to double down. This will only stop when Putin is dead and the Kremlin in its current form falls. Like, we need Russia to stop this. Like, we need for Putin's government to be defeated and for us to move on to what's next, and for Russia to become a normal nation state that gives up on its imperial ambitions. Like, this is about empire. The Wagner Group's expeditionary, they're just toppling governments in Central Africa, and they're replacing them with pro-Russian dictatorships. Whether you directly control those people or you just have a strong man who controls those people for you and is loyal to you, it's the same thing. This is about empire. It's about corruption. It's about enriching themselves. And Russia is never going to stop doing this as long as they think they're profiting from it, and it benefits their geopolitical objectives around the world. So if you want to defeat the creature, you got to cut its head off, and that's Putin and the Kremlin.
Yeah, I long for the day that he's out of the picture. But you mentioned geopolitical goals and drivers and such. So what do you think, looking ahead, Russia's are in vis-a-vis, particularly I'm thinking China, if things are basically going to fail away with the Trump administration? What is Putin's calculus going to be?
Putin just wants to go back to the status quo of the 1950s and 60s, where there are competing superpowers in a multipolar world. Basically, Russia wants to be a respected and feared empire that the world has to take into consideration anytime they make a decision. Whether Brazil and South Africa want to make a trade deal with each other or whatever, they should be consulting the Russians before they make that trade deal, because Russia is a great superpower in the world, and Russia should have a say in the bilateral relations of every other nation on Earth. Like, to a certain extent, in the post-World War II era, that's what everyone was doing with the United States. Anytime countries did actions with each other, they would have to be like, well, what's America going to say about this? What's America going to do about this?
Right.
It's that deference, it's that consideration that Russia is demanding, that they used to have more or less as the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, the capitalist democratic West didn't give an F what the Soviet Union thought or wanted, but Russia in its current form, with its mafia state capitalism, they want their hands in everything. They want their slice. They want their cut of everything that happens in the entire world. And they're never going to stop expanding and, investing in, buying out, using their wealth to get control of geopolitically strategic important points. This is never going to stop. Like, this ball has started rolling, and Russia has placed itself on this path. And Putin is saying, either we control everything or have a say in everything that happens in the world, or we're going to die. Sovyov says this every day on Kremlin State TV. We're not afraid to nuke the entire world. We're not afraid to kill everyone on the planet with our 6,000 nuclear warheads unless Russia has a say in everything that happens on this planet. What's the point of the world existing without Russia? That's the expression. That's what he says on Kremlin State TV. This is what the most insane and dangerous people in Russia's government actually do believe. If we can't have the final say over everything that happens in the world, well, we can just kill everyone in the world. Like, you can't stop us. If we die, everyone else dies.
I do worry, Jake, that every time we talk, you reference Russian state TV more and more frequently. So, I mean, I hope not watching too much that you're sort of beginning to...
I watch every clip from Russia Media Monitor. I've watched every clip from Julia Davis of the Daily Beast putting up these translations, and it's fascinating to watch. Like, it is entertaining how delusional and psychotic and dangerous these people are, but it's a dark mirror. It's a reflection of Russian society. It's perverse. It's not in any way news or reporting because it's all controlled by the Kremlin, but it's having an effect on me, having watching these clips now for 3 years and listening to how evil and sadistic these people are. Like, there's nothing in this world I want more, Pyotr, than for these people to be silenced, for these people to be defeated. The bile and vitriol that they spread across the world is killing people and making the entire planet sicker. And I want it stopped.
Well, I'm into that. I certainly think many of us will agree. But very last question for you, Jake, then is, you want to avoid prescribing, so to speak, other countries. But what would you encourage people to do, to look out for in the next sort of, over the summer, maybe when we have you back? What would you say? What would you like to leave people with?
Continue supporting Ukraine. My YouTube channel this week has exploded from people checking in, people getting updates with the attack on the bridge, with Operation Spiderweb, with these talks in Istanbul. The world has refocused on Ukraine. I understand there's other conflicts, other important issues going on, but Ukraine has the world's attention this week. And we have to make the case to the casual observer, the casual people who, they don't pay attention day to day, but they've got the broad strokes of what's going on. Russia is lying to the world. Russia does not want a ceasefire. Russia does not want peace talks. This war is only about taking territory and Russia restoring its imperial borders. And we have to support Ukraine. We have to find the political will. We've got to find the weapons. We've got to find the funding. And we got to make sure that Ukraine wins this war. Otherwise, you and I will be doing podcasts for the next 20 years about the invasion of the Baltics, the invasion of Finland, the invasion of Poland. I don't know. Or we'll all die in a lake of nuclear fire because Russia just launches everything. Like, we've got to find a solution. This is the number one issue in the world right now. We've not been taking it serious enough the last 3.5 years. And we got to work with the players we have. We got to work with the teams we got. But we have to find a way to defeat Russia. This is critical for the survival of humanity on this planet.
Quite the sentiment there, and I certainly agree with much of it. I hope everyone enjoyed it as well. And well, I don't think I need to tell you where to find Jake. It's pretty all over the YouTube channel area now as one of the foremost, I think, authorities on Ukraine, doing daily videos. And do check him out if you somehow don't know who he is. But thank you to everyone who put forward a question as well. I think there was a great diversity there, and well, I'll be doing my own bits as I can here and there, and we'll be sure to do this again soon, I think, Jake, right? But thank you very much again.
All right.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.